Hello, I'm Alexis Gooden, Curatorial Research Associate at the Clark Art Institute. I'd like to welcome you to today's opening lecture for the exhibition Nikolai Astrup, Visions of Norway. Today's lecture will be given by Marianne Stevens, guest curator of the exhibition. Before I introduce Marianne, I would like to take the opportunity to let you know that the exhibit will open at the Clark Art Institute this Saturday, June 19th, and run through September 19th. We are grateful to the public collections in Norway, as well as private lenders who have generously lent their paintings and prints to this exhibition, which is the first North American retrospective of Astrup's work. Nikolai Astrup, Visions of Norway, is organized by the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown in cooperation with Coda Art Museums and Composer Homes in Bergen, the Savings Bank Foundation DNB, and Prince Eugens Valdemarsudde in Stockholm, Sweden. On behalf of the Clark, I would like to thank these organizations for their partnership. The exhibition will travel to Bergen and Stockholm after it concludes at the Clark. Nikolai Astrup, Visions of Norway, is generously supported by the Savings Bank Foundation DNB. Additional support is provided by Richard and Carol Seltzer and Diane and Andreas Halvorsen. The exhibition catalog, which is edited by Marianne Stevens, has been published with generous support from the Savings Bank Foundation DNB and additional support for the Osborne Lundy Foundation. You can buy a copy of the catalog on site at the Clark's gift shop or order online through clarkart.edu. Today's lecture is the first of several public programming events hosted in conjunction with the exhibition. Please look at the exhibition tab of the Clark's website at clarkart.edu for more information about virtual and in-person events at the Clark related to Astr and our other summer programs. Today's lecture is supported by a grant from the Dr. Lee McCormick Edwards Foundation. We thank them for their generous support. Following the lecture today, Marianne Stevens will be happy to answer questions you have. Please send any questions via the Q&A tab on your screen if you're watching via Zoom. If you are watching the stream on Facebook Live, please add any questions to the comment section. We are recording today's lecture, and this will be part of the exhibition microsite on our website. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Marianne Stevens. Marianne Stevens is an art historian and curator who specializes in 18th through early 20th century art, with particular focus on British, French, and Nordic art of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Following an academic career, in 1973, she became Director of Academic Affairs at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and from 2005 to 2008, served as its acting secretary. While there, she curated many exhibitions on topics that include post-impressionism, Claude Monet, and Edvard Munch. She left the Royal Academy in 2013 to work as an independent art historian and curator. Most recently, she has curated exhibitions on Wilhelm Hammershøi in 2008, Nikolai Astrup in 2016, and Alfred Sisley in 2017. She is academic consultant to the Savings Bank Foundation DNB and to the Nikolai Astrup Research Center at Coda Art Museums and Composer Homes, Bergen. Marianne's lecture today is entitled Nikolai Astrup, the Visionary of Western Norway, an Artist Beyond Measure. Please help me welcome Marianne to the virtual podium, and thank you, Marianne, for being here with us today and for all the work that you did on this amazing exhibition.
Alexis, good morning, no, just good afternoon. I'm in a different time zone. Thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, and also a lot of useful information and background for the exhibition itself and its running at Clark. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Clark and all my colleagues there really for their enormous support and enthusiasm for this exhibition, and the fact that despite the trials and tribulations of the past year, the exhibition has managed to be opened this year, 1 year after it was due to be scheduled due to the pandemic. Right, I wanted to open this lecture with the portrait of Nikolai Astrup, age 20, by his fellow student Henrik Lund, as an introduction to the artist and to a few general remarks which will frame our journey through his life and work. Nikolai Astrup, who was born in 1880 and died in 1928 at the youthful age of 47, is one of Norway's best-loved artists, but he is relatively little known internationally. He was a painter, printmaker, horticulturalist, farmer, conservationist, and advocate of national Norwegian identity. Despite his celebration of the landscapes, traditional culture, and the myths of Norway, he was also committed to a modernist program for his paintings and his prints, strongly informed by contemporary modernist movements across Europe. And also, and very interestingly, he was a wordsmith, gifted with an exceptional vocabulary for the description of nature and color, the author of letters of which some 1,000 are recorded, and he was also a very cultured, highly educated individual, being well read in European as well as Norwegian literature. But alongside all this, he was also plagued by constant ill health from childhood onwards. He suffered from asthma, TB, and weak lungs. He had massive psychological mood swings from elation to deep depression and self-loathing, and he had a congenital persecution complex. He was also haunted by constant financial concerns. On the other hand, he was both fiercely ambitious for and profoundly uncertain or insecure about his art. Now, this lecture will consider 6 facets of Astrup's life and art in order to both introduce him to you and to give him a context within the cultural world of Norway during his lifetime. In order to understand Astrup's art and his aspirations, it is important to give a quick resume of recent Norwegian history, that is recent in Astrup's terms. Norway had been a dependency of Denmark until, let's go to the next one, here we go, until 1814, when it passed into Swedish hands. Despite Sweden's acceptance of a new Norwegian constitution, drafted also in 1814, that gave Norway a certain degree of autonomy in internal affairs, the 19th century saw rising demand for complete independence. This was finally gained in 1905, and the new nation was born. With the Constitution of 1814, there was a growing determination to assert Norwegian cultural identity. This ranged from the crafting of a language free from the official Danish one, and the recovery and publication of Nordic myths and folk tales, such as Asbjørn and Moe's publication of 1843, to the emergence of a Norwegian culture expressed in literature, through in Henrik Ibsen, for example, in music with Edvard Grieg, 2 of the images here on the screen, in art in the form of Gude and Tiedemann, with the painting on the left, and in architecture in this wonderful example of the Dalen Hotel Dalen in Telemark by Burfer in the dragon style. The need to return to the pure, authentic roots of Norwegian culture in order to forge a new national identity was proclaimed as early as in 1834 by the Norwegian poet Henrik Wergeland, and I quote, "The Norway of today and the Norway of ancient time can be compared to 2 halves of a broken ring that fit together exactly. The Middle Ages," by this he means the post-Viking age, "is an artificial intrusion which must be severed in order to complete the real link." This was, in a sense, a national Norwegian cultural manifesto, a call to arms, which was going to run right the way through the 19th century and act as a backdrop for Astrup's own career. So where did Astrup fit into this? Astrup belonged to the generation after the Neo-Romantics. These were artists who, during the 1880s, sought to create a new language of national identity for Norwegian art. This was based upon international painterly naturalism, acquired by Norwegian artists who had studied abroad in Germany, for example, especially Munich, and Paris. And a fine example of this would be Erik Werenskiold's very Norwegian-looking September of 1883. And equally significantly for Astrup, Astrup was 17 years younger than Edvard Munch. Astrup has suffered from this in respect of an international reputation, even though he has been highly regarded in his native Norway, and was as innovative a printmaker as was the older artist, who in fact collected some of his woodcuts. The purpose of this exhibition, therefore, is to bring Astrup out from behind or under this shadow into the spotlight that I believe he truly deserves. Let us turn to the artist himself. Astrup was born in 1880 on the western coast of Norway, north of Bergen, the son of a Lutheran pastor. And on the map on the left, I've got two arrows, one pointing where Bergen is, that's the lower arrow, and the upper arrow points to where the location of Jolster, to which the family moves in 1883 to the parsonage overlooking Lake Jolster itself. And the map on the right shows Jolster, Lake Jolster, Jolstravatnet, and if I can get my pointer to work, I can't. And here we are. There's Aarhus, and here is Sandal, which we're going to be referring to later after 1912. But this is his world, if you like. Ill health led, and here are two images of Aarhus, the church of which Astrup's father was pastor until his death in 1922. And on the right-hand side, a view across Lake Jolstravatnet from the parsonage garden, which is going to figure in quite a number of his works. Ill health led Astrup to seek respite in the fresh air. He explored the surrounding landscapes of Jolster at day and at night, developing acute powers of observation. The physical landscape, natural phenomena, and the myriad range of colors in nature generated, quote, an ecstatic response, which was to be translated into his paintings and prints. Despite his education to become a member of the civil service class, he was determined to be an artist in the face of bitter parental opposition. However, he finally gained permission to go to Christiania, now Oslo, that is the capital of Norway, to study in 1899. And for the next 2 years, he was primarily a student with Harriet Backer, a member of the neo-romantic generation of artists, such as Verenskiold, who we've already seen. Here, he already reveals an interest in painterly techniques and a heightened naturalism, as can be seen in the image on the right-hand side of, it's an academic nude male done while he was a pupil of Harriet Backer. It is extremely fluid and open in its brushwork, and rather daringly, it employs green and lilac in the shadows of the legs, rather than what you would expect, a more conventional grayer tone of pink. After a success in a group exhibition of 1901, he receives a scholarship and travels to Germany, where he studies the great museum collections of Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, and Munich, and is especially engaged with the work of the Swiss-German artist Arnold Böcklin. And then he moves on to Paris, the capital of the art world from the 1850s onwards, arriving in December 1901. Here he studies at one of the professional academies, private academies, the Académie Colarossi, and he also visits museums and exhibitions, where he is drawn to modern French artists such as Paul Gauguin, Maurice Denis, lower left-hand side, and the naive painter Henri Rousseau, who he considered one of the greatest artists after Michelangelo. But unlike most expatriate art students in Paris, he not only returns to Norway in May 1902 after a mere 5 months of study, but also exceptionally decides not to settle in the capital, Christiania, the artistic centre of Norway, but to return to Western Norway, to Jølster. He commits himself to celebrate through art the distinct landscape with its towering mountains, fjord-like waterfalls, meadows, and traditional buildings. Such was his familiarity with the landscape that his paintings became sequential views as he panned his angle of vision across the mountains or around his parents' parsonage garden. He seeks in this way to convey a strong sense of place. And if you were to paste the right-hand landscape onto the left-hand landscape, the mountain here is the mountain here. So what he's done is he basically has shifted his angle of vision, rather as if it were a film camera, from left to right, in order to grab the next bit of landscape that lies to the right of the view shown in a clear night in June. However, it is important to note that this is no photographic description of the landscape, but rather views instilled by intense appreciation of the region's specific qualities of changing weather, it was very damp, and seasons, and of light, notably the long northern summer night glow. And on the left-hand side, I've put rainy atmosphere beneath the trees, which has probably the widest range of greens I know an artist to employ in order to give this damp, dank almost sense of the landscape just after a heavy downpour. And on the right-hand side, we have this sort of magical glow of a Norwegian or a northern summer night, where the sun hardly sets below the horizon. Equally importantly, he has these views express an intense appreciation of the resonance of memory and childhood recollection, which elevate his paintings, for example, those of the family parsonage, to a level of dream reality. Here, this is particularly present in the right-hand image, where we actually have a small child looking in through the window of what is now a deserted property. This is the right-hand side of the parsonage, which was demolished in 1907. And it is almost a kind of wistful recall of a childhood location or locus, which for Astrup was absolutely crucial in shaping his view of nature and the wider world. I now want to turn initially to Astrup's prints. The same compulsion to capture Norway in painting led Astrup in 1904 to adopt neither etching plate nor lithographic stone for his prints, but the wood block to create woodcuts. It's important to note that wood is, of course, the most abundant of Norwegian natural resources. The technique he adopts is cutting the wood plank along the grain rather than across the grain. And the models for this technique were twofold. First of all, there were the Japanese ukiyo-e prints of Hiroshige and Hokusai, which are both of whose work Astrup was familiar with through the widespread circulation of their prints throughout Europe from the 1860s, and also through his own study in various museum collections. And secondly, there was the woodcut technique adopted by Edvard Munch from 1895 onwards. Now, the significance of using this mode of making woodcuts rather than the traditional woodcut engraving or wood engraving is that it produced some extremely pertinent and important visual results as far as Astrup is concerned. First of all, it reduced the possibility of creating the fine detail which was delivered by wood engraving. And instead, it produced clear, bold outline, simplification of form, and extensive areas of flat, unmodulated color, as is very well demonstrated in this pair of prints, Night Plowing, one of which was printed in around 1905. The block originates in a small block of 5 years earlier, and then a reworking of the woodcut in 1926-27, some 20 years later. Now, although he was influenced by Japanese prints, which he copied and analyzed, Astrup's approach to the technique of the woodcut was highly innovative. He hand-colored his blocks with rich pigments using oil-based ink rather than water-based ink, which gives a rich opacity, as it were, to the prints. He hand-printed his prints without using a printing press. And he reinforced the richness and density of an image by touching in areas of a woodcut with paint by hand after the print had been made. So in this print here, you will find that the blossoms on the trees and bushes, the marsh marigolds in the foreground, and some of the detail of the sky have all been touched in paint. But it's interesting to note that he also would modify over a block, over a period of printing, to obtain variations in the composition and to express different moods. Thus, as you can see here, we have two very different colored, tonally marked prints. And this is very much an indication of the way in which Astrup saw effectively each print as a unique impression. It was a unique work of art in its own right, not part of a reproductive process. Astrup's journey to establish a new national visual language involved embracing modernist art, yet resulted in a highly individual manifestation, the product of careful evaluation and internalization of current European modernisms. How did this come about? Now, having worked in a modified form of international painterly naturalism for the first decade of his professional career, as is demonstrated in Grey Spring Evening with Fruit Trees in Blossom, here, a painting of 1909, Astrup was beset with a major crisis of confidence from about the date of the making of this painting to February 1911. It led to a profound questioning of the quality of his own art and the direction in which he should be or could be going. This was coupled with mixed critical reception for his third solo exhibition in Christiania. And taken together, these caused him to, first of all, travel to Berlin in spring 1911, and then around Germany and Copenhagen. In Berlin, he effectively retrains, enrolling himself with the German proto-expressionist artist Lovis Corinth, who was teaching at the private Academy Leuven Funke, and studies the work of Corinth, Slavocht, and other modernist artists, showing in exhibitions in Berlin while he was there. On his return, he leaves Aarhus, crosses the Lake Joster to establish the farmstead, which was to be his home from 1912 to his death 16 years later. Now, then known as Sandalstrand, now known as Astrup Tunnel. Astrup purchased the small, highly unprepossessing and unpromising farmstead on the precipitous north-facing slope of Lake Joster, into which he moved with his wife, Engel Sunda, and their first child, Kari, in 1912. There he accumulated old buildings to accommodate a family that would eventually number 8 children and his mother-in-law. And he finished the exercise with the largest of them, what he called his castle here, which included a purpose-built studio on the top floor, which was completed by the end of 1925. And I just show you 2 views here, one of the studio itself through a wonderful old apple tree, and on the right-hand side, and in an interior of the so-called castle. He also undertook the sculpting of the landscape through the creation of terraces, plots for the more extensive cultivation of vegetables, borrowed landscapes, and also created landscape art. Troll trees, for example, which were achieved through pollarding. Indeed, he created an exceptional multifunctional farmstead. And I'm sorry for the quality of the image on the left-hand side, but this is a photograph which comes from a photographic archive, which was taken, as it says here, in about 1921, giving very much a sense of this terracing, this extensive terracing, which was the only way that Astrup could gain any cultivable land on this extremely difficult site. Now, this multifunctional farmstead had to fulfill a number of functions, hence multifunctional. It had to produce food for his ever-growing family. It was also a venue for horticultural experimentation, for example, for his 10 different variants of rhubarb or the grafting of fruit trees. And you can see on the left-hand side in Nightlight rhubarb, gruesome bird cherry tree, wonderful example of one of his, in this case, rather large or outgrown rhubarb plant. It was also had to serve as a conservation haven because Astrup rescued plants, vegetables, fruit trees, and wildflowers of endangered by the advance of modern farming practices. For example, he rescued the local rutabaga and also marsh marigolds. Therefore, the conservation of old buildings and plants from the region inevitably transformed the property into one with a distinctly Norwegian character, and hence it became a quiet manifesto for Norwegian national identity. But even more importantly, and exceptionally, the project at Sandalstrand involved the shaping of nature, the sculpting of the land, the creation of a controlled nature, which provided the motifs for a significant percentage of his artistic output post-1914. It became a springboard for innovative creative practices both in his paintings and prints. In other words, it was an artist's garden. This aligns Astrup with other artist gardeners, such as Claude Monet at Giverny or John Henry Twachtman at Willowbrook outside Greenwich, Connecticut, both of whom were using the gardens that they planned and cultivated very much as a kind of testing ground to construct compositions which were then the subject of their art. What was the impact of Sandalstrand on Astrup's mature work? Astrup was persistently interested, despite his so-called self-imposed exile in Ulster, in recent developments in Norwegian and European art. He traveled, he kept informed through exhibitions in Christiania and Bergen, had contact with Norwegian modernist artists, and had access to art journals which discussed international modern art. He therefore was able to evaluate proto-expressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, the work of Matisse and his Nordic students. He read avant-garde treatises, for example, those by Wassily Kandinsky, and even determined to visit Kandinsky in Munich to learn more about abstract art. He consistently interrogated the meaning and implications of such terms as abstraction, cubism, primitivism, and naive art, in order to understand the degree to which it would be useful in shaping or informing his own art. The impact of all of this on his own art can be seen in a number of different ways. First of all, there was a use of a heightened palette, and this is clearly demonstrated birthday in the parsonage garden, where the intensity of the colors, particularly the reds, the oranges, the greens, have really taken on a kind of vibrancy well beyond the more subdued tonalities of the pre-1911 paintings. Secondly, there was a simplification of forms. We've already seen that emerging in his prints pre-1911, but here in paintings, we see a much more systematic and almost analytical identification of the different elements within a composition, and then paring them down to their essence, their essential characteristics. Thirdly, there is a disregard of traditional perspectival systems, such as you find in Spring in Jølster on the right-hand side of the screen, where there are multi-viewpoints within a single composition. We're looking up into the painting, into the composition, we're looking down precipitously to the lake, and in the background sits the landscape, all as it were, seen from different points of view. And also, he adopts eccentric relative scaling within a single composition. In the interior still life, Christmas morning on the left-hand side, the scale of the objects in the foreground read completely illogically in relation to the scale of the little girl, nude, who's seated on the right-hand side on the bench. The candlestick, on the other hand, seems to be gigantic, overwhelming the small child. This absence of the need to feel tied by the conventions of traditional art is very much part of this new language that he was seeking to explore. Likewise, there is an impact on his prints because they become increasingly innovative in technique and in scale, and larger in scale. We find, for example, him undertaking major experimentation in the interaction between print and painting. On the left-hand side on the screen here, we have Foxgloves, a painting of 1909. He then, as it were, chops off the right-hand side and uses it as the basis of the left-hand side of the print Foxgloves made, this one in 1925, to which he then adds the two little girls collecting berries and the foliage and in the background, and then a mountain, which looks rather like Mount Fuji, and actually changes from each version of this print. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. He also works in reverse order. So he makes a print, for example, Sandalstrand, which is a black and white woodcut on the left-hand side, and then uses that as the basis for a painting, such as the one Growing Season Weather of 1918 to 21 on the right-hand screen. He also heightened opaque color to create a hybrid sort of modern painterly print, where he lays paint on the top of a print, such as he's doing here. This is painting transferred into a print. But what is fascinating here is that actually the sky seems to be almost entirely washed in after the print has been made, as indeed are the details of the marsh marigolds, his beloved marsh marigolds, in the foreground, and so on. Now, all of this is to not only create a much richer impression, but also it is a move towards what Astrup entitled a modern painterly print, which, as he recommended to a friend of his, if you were to varnish a print like this, it would look like a painting. While these all registered a significant advance on his earlier work, it is important to note that there are two preoccupations that continued to inform Astrup's entire output. First, there was the primacy of memory and childhood recollection, which haunts his compositions and distances his work from any direct relationship with reality or immediacy. And here this is very well demonstrated in Rhubarb, a painting which purports to be of the parsonage garden at Aarhus, with its picket fence in the background, started in 1911, probably, before he travels across the lake to Sandalstrand the following year. but actually was still being worked on in 1918 and is only brought to a sufficient level of completion for it to be sold 3 years later. So it is as much the creation of recollection and memory as it is of the places, of the real observation, if you like, of the scene itself. And furthermore, and interestingly, it is certainly banishes any notion that this was done in front of the motif. The other leitmotif, which seems to run through, it seems to run through Astrup's entire oeuvre, is his profound interest in and engagement with Nordic mythologies and local Western Norwegian traditions, beliefs, and customs, which are filtered through the transformations of nature. A coffee pot shadow is magnified in size as if conjured up in the dream of a sleeping woman. It takes on a sort of mythic quality. Or equally, the grain poles upon which grain was dried in this area of Norway because it was so damp that there was no way in which you could dry grain by stacking it up in stoops or placing it on a grain stack. These poles turn mysteriously into an army of trolls marching across a recently harvested field. Likewise, pollarded trees transform themselves into trolls, as in Spring Night and Willow on the left-hand screen. The arms of the branches of the tree are sprouting fingers, which then turn into smaller branches, as the troll emerges, lifting its arms up to the sky, or perhaps greeting the sun. Melting snow on mountains reveals shapes, which reveals slopes either populated by animals, or as the snow melts, reveals in the upper reaches of the mountain the figure of a reclining nude, known as the Ice Queen, as we see in the print on the right, Elements from Spring and Desire. And in the Midsummer Eve bonfire paintings and prints, there is a fusion of the Christian celebration of the feast of St. John the Baptist on the 23rd of June and the pagan summer solstice festival, which celebrated fertility and rebirth. And here, as if to capture the more pagan or mythic qualities of this celebration, Astrup has not only transformed the flames of the bonfire itself into the form of a dragon, but he also allows the shadow, or transforms the shadow cast by the man lifting up his hands in the background here, arms, into a troll-like figure which stalks him, as it were, from the boulder behind. And equally, the dancers, the revelers, are having their music provided by the fiddler, who is playing a hardanger fiddle. Hardanger fiddle was regarded as the instrument of the devil. And it was actually interesting that it was only as late as 1923 that the instrument was actually permitted to form part of Lutheran church bands. Astrup's reputation as an artist of distinction was noted during his lifetime, not least by one of his closest friends, the Norwegian writer Hans Chink, who wrote in 1911, "All of Astrup's art is at one and at the same time about naturalism, romance, and symbolism, and naivism, and none independent of the other. He is an artist beyond measure, who expresses by dint of his knowledge, his primitive diversity. He stood in ecstasy, and his art rose out of this ecstasy. The experience simply and unashamedly translated into color. And his work is still celebrated today by such writers as the award-winning Norwegian author Knut Korsgaard, a contributor to exhibition catalogue, in his book Winter of 2017. Quote, Astrup's paintings are aglow with colour and simplified planes, which give them a powerful radiance, and which no other art or literature from this part of the country have ever come close to rivaling. The exhibition, Nikolai Astrup, Visions of Norway, consists of some 95 paintings and prints. It closes with a space in which the Midsummer Eve bonfire paintings and prints explode within Astrup's landscape of Western Norway. It opens with the visual mapping of his Jolster days, lays out the development of his remarkable innovative prints, and marks the evolution and impact of his transformations at Sandalstrand. It invites visitors to be immersed in Astrup's magical, poetic world, to discover his powerful demonstration of an individual, deeply considered visual exposition of modernist art in the opening decades of the 20th century. I hope you will visit the exhibition, come to discover Astrup, and enjoy his work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne, for that insightful lecture and for bringing Astrup alive to audiences here in North America this summer. I do have some questions in the chat that I will pose to you now, and I welcome any attendees to similarly put their questions in the chat or in Facebook Live, the comment section, so that we can ask them directly of Marianne. Marianne, the first question, it's a clarification about the parsonage. Was the parsonage where he lived or where his Lutheran minister worked? So just a little clarification about the Aarhus parsonage.
Sorry. The Aarhus parsonage was the building to which Astrup's father and mother and family, there were 14 children in the family, many of them died, unfortunately, moved in 1883. So it was Astrup's, it was his parental home and it was his childhood home. He remained in residence in the parsonage, in fact, on and off until 1912, when he moved across the lake, initially to a small village called Mythic, and then up to Sandalstrand by the end of that year. I hope that's clear.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit about process, we have a question about if Astrup used oil paints with a brush to touch up the prints directly, as opposed to inking the block. So just to describe his process a little bit to make those impressions so very distinctive.
There are two points there. One is that what makes his prints so rich is that he used increasingly an oil-based ink for the printing process. So that would be what would be laid on the blocks. But when he came to touch over the top of the print by hand, that would then, we think, is oil paint. But I have to say that more technical analysis has to be done to be absolutely certain that we're right as far as this technique is concerned.
Thank you. Here's a broader question that invites comparison with another artist. It seems like there are parallels between Carl Larsson of Sweden and Astrup. Were there other contemporary Scandinavian artists as well who were capturing their local landscapes and home life and culture?
Two particular points there. One is, yes, there is a sort of parallel with Carl Larsson, insofar as Carl Larsson is one of the not very numerous artists who was both a horticulturalist as well as an artist. And so he's making his garden to provide the motifs, just as Monet did at Giverny and Astrup at Sandalstrand, for his art. And you're absolutely right that this sense of home and place is common to Larsson and to Astrup. In terms of the broader, on the other hand, Larsson, of course, works primarily, but not exclusively, in watercolor. He also works, of course, on a very large scale, but he is not perhaps quite as he certainly doesn't engage in the woodcut or the print in the way that Astrup does, and certainly not in an innovative way. For other Scandinavian or Nordic artists who are also celebrating their own, or giving us a sense of place, if you like, as Astrup does, I would point, for example, to an artist such as Anders Zorn, who, although highly international, and he came to the States, he traveled, he exhibited in Paris, he was known as well outside Sweden as he was in Sweden. He, however, was based at Mora, north of Stockholm, and certainly a lot of the landscapes and the local traditions, the customs, the costumes, and so on, form very much a part of his visual vocabulary.
Here's a question diving into some of the paintings and prints that we saw, something about the architecture and traditional building of Norwegian houses. In some of the paintings of the houses with thatched roof, it looks like there are flowers or various colored plants growing on the roofs. Was that intentional, or did it just happen? Or did Astrup add this from his imagination? Do you have any sense of this building technique, Marianne?
Lovely idea of Astrup. Actually, yeah, I'll answer that one in two ways. One is actually, they're not thatched roofs. They are roofs which have a wood base with bark, birch bark, laid over the top in order to provide a runoff for the water at the edges, at the bottom, the edges of the roof, and then turf is laid on the top. Now, once you lay turf, of course, it can self-seed, or wildflowers can self-seed. But and I'm sure that was the case. So it wasn't, and it is the case today. So that wasn't part of Astrup's sort of artistic license, if you like. But at the same time, what is interesting is that when he moved to this interim farmstead or property on the southern side of Lake Jølster, after he left Aarhus in 1912, he built himself a house there, which was up against a steep slope. And he talks in one of his long letters describing what he was doing on this property of sowing flowers on the roof. So it would seem that he may have sown some wildflowers also on some of the turf roofs at Sandalstrand.
How about a sort of broader question again about Astrup's recognition? Was he recognized and a commercial success in his lifetime? How and when did he emerge as a quintessential figure of Norwegian national identity?
Astrup was relatively successful during his lifetime. He certainly received critical acclaim, particularly early on in his career. Later on, I think he had more of a struggle because a lot of his earlier clientele wanted him to go on painting like he painted in the first 10 years of his career. Endless views of Jølster in a painterly style and sort of quasi-naturalistic. And this was something that disturbed Astrup distinctly, and he refers to it in his correspondence, that people are asking me, keep on demanding that I should do more landscapes, more works like my early work, and I can't do that. I have to move on. And that's the responsibility of an artist, which I think speaks mountains really for his determination to go on forging his own distinct style, form of modernism. In terms of success in his later career, he certainly made more easy money, if you like, out of his prints than out of his paintings. But even there was a challenge because making his prints could often be a very laborious process. Bear in mind that he was printing them all by hand, that they would sometimes involve between 6 and 10 blocks, all of which had to be keyed and registered. It was technically incredibly demanding. Also, given that he was using oil-based ink, it took long for the ink to dry. And so it could take, for example, as with the foxgloves, a process of 3 months to create one print. So it's not as if you could go to the printing press, turn the wheel and run off 60 versions of a print or 50 versions of a print, which is effectively what Munch did. That's a bit simplifying the argument, but it is the case that he could produce myriad examples of these prints through making use of a printing press. In terms of his reputation, he was during his lifetime recognized as the leading artist of Western Norway, and certainly that reputation held. And there was a big memorial exhibition of his work in 1928, both in Bergen and in Christiania, then Oslo, because it changed its name and became Oslo. And he goes on receiving exhibitions of his work, both solo and group, throughout the subsequent decades. So Norway never really lost sight of Astrup. And one of the things I find fascinating is the number of Norwegian friends and acquaintances who comment upon the fact that they remember a print of Astrup hanging in their grandmother's front room, or how they had Astrup images as illustrations in their history books, and so on. So he's been very much part of kind of Norwegian visual culture.
Thank you. And this is sort of to build on that answer and question. Why do you suppose that his art has not previously been well known outside of Norway? It seems his work embraced elements of magical realism and would have been welcomed by a larger audience. Do you have a reason as to why Astrup is not so well known outside of Norway?
It's very interesting that after his death, his prints were included in some group print exhibitions which traveled outside Norway. But that doesn't seem to have registered him as somebody particularly exceptional in this field, comparable, I would argue, absolutely with the innovative achievements of Munch in the print field. I think that there are two real impediments which made Astrup, the exportation of Astrup, difficult. One is the fact that, with the exception of, I believe, one and now possibly two paintings by Astrup, which hang in collections outside Norway, all of his work is held either in public collections in Oslo, in Bergen, in Trondheim, Smallmount, in Stavanger, and in private collections in Norway. So if you don't have a representative example of an artist's work whose name is little known to the wider public, hanging on the wall of, say, a museum in London or Paris or Washington, DC or Boston, for example, then your visitor there is unlikely to bump into or become familiar with that artist in any way at all. There's no way that they can. So that's one problem. And the second, I think, is the fact that up until 2010, literature about Astrup was almost entirely in Norwegian. So there was a language barrier to access to Astrup, the artist. And it was only with funding from the foundation, DNB, that made it possible for key text to be translated into English for the first time. And this was a major breakthrough because it suddenly opened up the possibility for non-Norwegian speakers to begin to make his acquaintance.
Thank you. I have some questions about the particular works in exhibitions. For one, are all the works that you showed in your slide presentation, are these in the Clark exhibition?
All bar one. And the only one that I put in, I snuck in, was because it shows the cultivated garden at Sandalstrand so well, which is the one of the cold frame, which is a view across a cold frame and down onto the Borgen below. But otherwise, yes, everything that I showed was in the exhibition.
And another question, somewhat related, can you elaborate on the size or scale of the works? It's hard to tell in a webinar how large some of these works are. He seems to use every area of the canvas. It's so beautiful to see so much richness in his works through color and different focal points. No matter where you look, you can see something interesting. So could you speak to the scale of these works?
Yes, they are, I would say, generally speaking, he works on a modest to relatively large scale. Certainly the ones in the exhibition are all, I have to start thinking in inches. Gosh, Alexis, you're going to have to help me. How do we say? They're about 3 feet wide by, say, 2.5 feet tall, something like that, 3 by 2. However, there are some exceptions to this, and the penultimate bonfire, Midsummer Eve bonfire painting I showed you is considerably larger than that. It's close to, well, it's 3 meters, isn't it? So it's a lot of 9 feet, something like that, by 6 foot. And also the extraordinary landscape called Column, of that sort of block of mountain, straight frontal onto the picture plane with Lake Josta in the foreground. That also is on a slightly larger scale.
I have that at 40 inches by 48 inches for people who want to absolutely know the colon measurements.
I'm sorry, we've gone completely metric this side of the Atlantic. The prints, on the other hand, I should explain, start from really the relatively small. I mean, here we're talking about 12 inches wide, yeah, to with the prints, most of the prints before 1909. By the time you get to the foxgloves, we're into 20 something. I think it's 24 by something. So effectively, it's more than doubled.
Yes,
size.
I think his small self-portrait is probably 4 inches wide and 4 inches high. It's quite small. But yes, the larger foxglove prints, for which we have 3 wood blocks on view as well at the Clark, those measure 26 inches high by 30 wide. So they are very rich, immersive experiences to see those in person. So.
And in a way, you can understand why Astrup felt that if he increased the scale of the prints, as long as he could master the technical aspects of it, and also suggest that you put varnish on them, they could be the equivalents of paintings.
I have a couple more questions. Here's one about how did you locate the private collection pictures?
Well, here I have to give credit to some wonderful Norwegian friends who could not have been more helpful in locating a lot of the Astrups in private collections. They too had been major collectors, and are, and it therefore was a wonderful way in, and they very much helped us in opening the doors for talking to private collectors about the importance of this exhibition, traveling abroad, and also the importance for the profile and the reputation of Astrup. And so I'm inordinately grateful to them for that help and assistance. In addition, we had some help from the auction houses when a work of art had passed through the collections, and also in the early, because we were beginning the Catalogue Raisonné project online, which is being managed through the Astrup Research Center at Coda Art Museums and Composer Homes in Bergen. There was already the beginnings of an identification of some locations.
Fantastic. One last question. We are at 1 o'clock here on the East Coast. One question about the variations in the prints, wondering how much variation there really is in different copies of the prints. And I think this is a great one to end on, because it will hopefully encourage everyone to come to the Clark and to see this for themselves.
Yes, I've spent a lot of time and effort in making certain that in each sequence of prints, the ways in which Astrup manipulated both the compositional detail and the tonalities becomes very clear, and I hope sort of jumps off the wall. Because if you compare one with t'other, you quickly realize that all sorts of funny things are going on, whether it's retouching with paint over the top of the print, whether it's changing the tonalities, because you will find that, for example, with the bird on a stone, which I didn't show you, this is the most Japanese of his prints, we move from a rather dark impression where you feel there might be a storm coming on, or it's an evening light, I think is probably better to explain it, to something which seems to be in broad, brilliant sunshine, midday. But likewise, if you look closely at the waterfall and glacier, you'll notice that the shape of the house on the right-hand side changes from one print to the next. So he was deciding to eliminate a bit of the house on the right, in order to print the black and white print on the left. So it's all sorts of little shifts like that, but always with this intention of making certain that each is, in the end, essentially a unique impression.
Well, thank you for that explanation and for all of the answers to the questions, which were really wonderful. And of course, for the lecture today. This has been incredibly exciting to hear and to think about actually coming into the galleries. I do have a couple comments in the chat that say, thank you. I'm inspired to both visit the Clark Art Institute, the exhibition, as well as Norway. So I think this has been a really exciting moment in our day. And I hope that this does bring people to see the exhibition here in Williamstown. So I think I'd like to again thank Marianne for speaking today, and to our support staff, Marcy and John, for helping the webinar go forward. And thank all of the attendees. Again, this is going to be on our website very shortly, the clarkart.edu exhibition microsite for the Astrup exhibition. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Marianne.
Thank you very much.